Let me start by thanking the Universidade Católica of Portugal and, of course, the Institute for Political Studies and Professor João Carlos Espada, my good friend. He is somewhere in the room. I am going to try to make good use of my 5 minutes, the 5 minutes allotted to me as host of this session. But even though I am not going to be able to say everything that I would like to tell you during the 5 minutes, you may know in advance that my extended remarks will be published by the magazine of the Institute for Political Studies at the next issue. So you will have ample opportunity to read and to reflect on what I would like to say if I would have, instead of 5 minutes, 45 minutes or 1 hour and a half. So let me start, and in a nutshell, to tell you that we may assume that the former president of the European Commission, José Manuel Durão Barroso, who was here at this very table yesterday, is absolutely right when he says that it is not in the interest of the West, as it is not in the interest of Russia, that a conflict of bigger proportions escalates and indeed transform in an unthinkable way the international order and the way we are used to live. So departing from that assumption, and I entirely agree with the wise remarks of José Manuel Durão Barroso, assuming that it is not in the interest of the West, as it is not in the interest of Russia to get engulfed in a conflict of bigger proportions, the question that, in my opinion, is the key question, and I would like also that the members of the panel take the challenge of answering to this question during their own remarks and the debate that will follow. The key question is how are we going to achieve the goal of avoiding a conflict of bigger proportions and not selling our souls to the devil, meaning what would we need to do in order to contain Russia instead of accommodating Russia. I know that there are out there many politicians, even politicians in prominent international responsible positions, and there are also a plethora of academics and intellectuals out there that still believe that we need to accommodate Russia. I don't share that position. I believe that the only way to avoid a conflict of greater proportion and the only way to achieve in the very long run a stable strategic relationship with Russia is to contain Russia. And to contain Russia means to counter the strategic assertiveness of Russia. And I am also of the opinion that what is at stake in Ukraine at this point in time is exactly the challenge of how to contain Russia, to uphold the international rules-based order and avoid further disasters in the looming future. How to do it is obviously the big question, and it is the big difficulty. We all know that Russia, the Kremlin, Putin, are inspired by the Primakov doctrine, And we all know what that means because we all studied carefully the 5 principles of the Primakov Doctrine, and we know that Russia is not comfortable, is not at ease with the strategic context that prevails in Europe and that prevails essentially after 89, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the implosion of the Soviet Union. We all know that immediately in the Western Balkans, with the death of Yugoslavia, all these symptoms were already in motion. And so it should be not a big surprise if we conclude that the speech of Vladimir Putin in February 2007 at the Munich Security Conference was the intellectual embodiment of what we are witnessing today in Ukraine. And obviously in August 2008, what happened in Georgia was a symptom, and then 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the hybrid war in the Donbass. But many chose to either to ignore it or not to do what needed to be done at that very important juncture. But now the brutal impact of reality is with us, and the international order that we still believed that we could live under is obviously shattered by the bombings in Ukraine. So I will stop here. You will have the pleasure to read me at length. I am going now to give the floor to my good friend Jakub Klepal. You may know that I am now the ambassador of Portugal in Prague, in the Czech Republic, and that Jakub Klepal is the organizer of Forum 2000 that will take place this year by the end of August. And the Forum 2000 in the Czech Republic is the equivalent, the sister organization of the Estoril Political Forum. So with great pleasure, listen carefully. Jakub Klepal is a remarkable thinker. Jakub, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Thank you very much, Luis, for this kind introduction. Today we have a very packed panel, so I will not speak long. I would just like to also extend my thanks to our hosts, Professor Espada and his colleagues, for putting on this excellent platform, this excellent Estoril Political Forum, which we are a proud partner of at the Forum 2000. Last year, in October, we had a similar discussion at this forum on Russia and the West. At that time, 8 months ago, we were agreeing that the relations between Russia and the West were more or less frozen. There was less and less communication, and we also were discussing how to respond to those increasing tensions. We, I think, agreed that a global cooperation of democracies, the coordination of democratic countries is one way forward on this potential threat. Today, we are here at a situation which has changed dramatically after the Russian aggression to Ukraine, and we perhaps a little surprisingly see that Ukraine is standing firmly, West is standing firmly vis-à-vis this aggression. So we can, with I think some hope and optimism, look at the future. What should we do in this situation? Where should we focus our priorities? What the next step should be? And this will also be, as Luis mentioned, one of the important issues for discussion at this year's Forum 2000 conference, and it should also be partly discussion at this panel. We have several issues at hand that we need to focus on concerning Ukraine and concerning Russia. One of them is the European path for Ukraine. We've seen last week that the European Council agreed on giving the candidate status to Ukraine as well as Moldova. This means that the process of Ukrainian discussions about becoming a member can start. But there's many things to be done, many things to do, many milestones to fulfill. There is also the reconstruction of Ukraine. I mean, the war is still raging, but we need to start thinking about it. We need to start planning it. We need to think not only about physical reconstruction, but we need to think about the reconstruction of institutions. We need to think about helping Ukraine, creating a resilient post-war democracy, again for the purpose of joining fully the Western democratic community. And there is also the issue of dealing with the crimes that Russia has been committing in Ukraine during this war, and this is an item that we will be looking at ever more intensely in the future. And lastly, and this is also going to be a part of the discussions here today, a big issue, and Luis has touched upon it, and Karl Gershman has touched upon it yesterday in his remarks. We need to start thinking, or we need to think deeply what to do with Russia, how to relate to Russia, what the Russian position in the world is, how we deal with the Russian opposition, how we cooperate with our Russian partners in this very changed situation. So some of these issues will be also topic for the panel. And with that, I would like to open the discussion. Our first speaker will actually be on the screens. It will not be a physical speaker here in this room. We will show you an interview done by our colleague on the panel, Miroslava Gungadze, with Ukrainian historian currently at Harvard, Serhii Plochy. So I would like the organizers to please put the interview on. Thank you.
We will start with the collapse of Soviet Union and the Western policies toward countries of Soviet Union. From today's perspective, do you think that West, that we're trying to build the closer relationship with Russia and trying to make Russia a democracy, actually made a mistake in some way?
It's quite clear that Western policy, and in particular the policies of the United States, were really centered on Russia. And this is very clear from what happened with the seat of the Soviet Union in the Security Council in the United Nations. Now, in particular, the Ukrainian representative raises the question of, okay, Russia was not even elected as, or didn't go through the right procedure to become the member of the UN or the member of the Security Council. It just inherited the seat of the Soviet Union. And this is just one of many examples where Russia was certainly treated very differently from any other country, and in particular from any other republic of the Soviet Union. Another example of that is, of course, what happened with the nuclear weapons. Russia ended up to be the only republic of the post-Soviet space, and there were 4 altogether who had nuclear arsenals on their territory that inherited all of the Soviet weapons. And to add insult to injury, Ukraine in particular, but also other countries, were forced to move the nuclear weapons from their territory to the territory of Russia. And Ukraine at that time already was raising concerns about what would happen with those weapons. That by transferring weapons to Russia, Ukraine was endangering its own security. So there was certainly Russia first policy from the start go. And what that meant also was that whatever actions were there, and we now know those were beginning of this imperialist return of Russia, they were really to a degree ignored. the Western countries were looking in a different direction. This is in particular true about Chechnya. That was certainly the first imperial and colonial war. We are talking today about war in Ukraine as imperial and colonial, but it's not the first one, and even the invasion of Georgia in 2008 was not the first one. There were two wars in Chechnya, the wars out of which actually today's Russian state emerged as a state that really was designed from the very beginning to be able to wage the war, which was the war of attrition.
So it's basically enabled Russia to the action that we are seeing today.
Certainly, that is the case, because look at what happened, for example, in 1993 with the really de facto end of democracy in Russia, the Russian President Boris Yeltsin ordering troops, ordering tanks, shooting at the building of the Russian parliament. That was basically supported by the West. The question is why? The West saw certainly in Yeltsin the best chance to save democracy in Russia by really supporting this attack on democracy. And then in Russia, it saw the best chance of maintaining some sort of stability on the post-Soviet space. So the concerns were nuclear weapons, the concerns were security, and I'm not saying that those concerns were not illegitimate ones. But prioritizing them meant also prioritizing Russia and really putting the rest of the post-Soviet space into a very, very difficult position.
Was there other way for the Western policy toward the region?
Well, definitely there was, and I will give you an example of Ukraine and the story of the nuclear weapons and the Budapest Memorandum. Because I understand what were the foundations of those decisions that were made, that just removing nuclear weapons from as many countries and republics as possible to stop proliferation of the nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. But once that decision was adopted and once Ukraine was really forced to give up its nuclear weapons, what happened, the vacuum, the security vacuum, emerged in the center of Europe. And that security vacuum had to be filled with something. For example, either NATO or the kind of a Budapest Memorandum that would provide Ukraine and other republics with guarantees as opposed to the assurances. So the immediate threat that was there to the West, the nuclear weapons, was eliminated. But the fact that the countries from which the nuclear weapons were removed were left in very vulnerable situation was completely ignored.
We are talking about the Western policies. How about Russia? We cannot blame just the West for what really happened inside of Russia. What was the reason and for the development of the Russia how it is today? Because there was a point of time in history when Russia, we had a lot of hope, and the West had a lot of hope that Russia actually can become a democracy.
Well, if you look at what is happening in Russia in the late 1980s, it is certainly one of the beacons of democracy and democratic development and mobilization in the post-Soviet space. We have President Yeltsin being elected against the wishes of Gorbachev as the president of Russia, supported by huge democratic mobilization in Russia, when in Ukraine we didn't have anything of that sort, certainly in 1989, 1990, and for a good part of 1991 as well. So it was almost natural to expect that Russia would lead in terms of the democratic transformation of the Soviet Union. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. It was already very clear by 1993 when the very same parliament that President Yeltsin was defending back in 1991 was now shot at on his orders. Why did that happen? Well, one of the reasons is that we believed, and I'm talking now about not just politicians, not about West, a general public, and including myself at that time, that really a sort of an end of history came on the international scene. That countries were being transformed out of the simple fact that the pressure of communism was removed. That almost by nature the nations and the countries and the peoples were democratic. You remove that the communist layer and the democracy would flourish. That was unspoken agreement that existed there, that was shared by very many. What we know now that history didn't end, and that history matters. And the democracy, it's a very complex way of conducting political life, social life. Churchill at some point said that democracy is the worst form of government except every other form of government. And in Russian history, in terms of tradition, intellectual tradition, in terms of the institutions, there was really limited number of experience that would serve as a foundation for the democratic development. So history mattered, and history largely of Russia was the country of undemocratic development, where the state and the interests of the state were at the very center of the political life, where the state was all dominant. And when Russia started to experience difficulties, economic difficulties with the democracy and democratic institution, what was there to unite the country around was the state and the power of the state. And that was already, the foundations for that were already created by the constitution that was adopted by Boris Yeltsin, who certainly came from the West immediately after this shooting at the Russian parliament, and arrest of the leaders of the opposition. The opposition was communist and nationalist. This is true from that point of view. Yeltsin indeed looked as the best hope for the Russian democracy, but the way how it was done created really foundations for the new Russian state, which would be as authoritarian as were the majority of the governments, of the states, of the regimes in Russian history. It doesn't mean that Russia or any other country is really doomed by history to be either authoritarian or democratic or have any other form of government. But the lesson that we learned is that these changes and the transformations of that kind don't happen overnight. It is a process. It is a long process, and that's the lesson of the 1990s that we should keep in mind today, especially given that more and more we talk about the future of Russia, about Russia without Putin. And again, that's where, when we start these discussions, when we have these discussions, not to get into the traps, into the same issues that we got in the 1990s, and then be again very much surprised that our wishful thinking doesn't somehow come to life.
You were saying, if I understand you correctly, that it's rather natural development in Russia to become an authoritarian state. How about other countries of the region? Is it differ in Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, and others?
Now, 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, we see that in some parts of the Soviet Union, the democratic changes and transformations that started in the late 1980s and went into the early 1990s, they actually, those seeds, they produced really very, very significant results. And I'm talking about Baltic states, for example. Baltic states that, in terms of the democratic record today, are ahead of countries like Poland and Hungary, for example. We also see that the Ukraine is the second largest Soviet republic, also stayed democratic despite attempts at least twice to crush that democracy. It ended, the society responded with two Maidans. We can also look at what is happening in Moldova. The democracy, it's not like democracy was a complete failure. It was defeated everywhere on the territory of the Soviet Union. But the majority of the post-Soviet states really returned to different forms of authoritarian rule. And if you look at geography of where it is happening, if you look at history of those countries, and predominantly this would be Central Asia and partially Caucasus, you will find more or less the same pattern as in the history of Russia. Very little tradition of the democratic development. From a Ukrainian's point and perspective, very interesting is an example of Belarus, which is really very close, that shared a lot of history with Ukraine, including being part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, being divided between Poland and the Soviet Union during the interwar period. But again, that had chosen the more like a Russian way. And the question is why. And one of the answers again can be found in history, and that's the history of the Ukrainian regionalism, that really doesn't exist to that degree in Belarus. And regionalism was certainly used against Ukraine back in 2014 in an attempt to destabilize, undermine the unity of the country, and so on and so forth. But it's also the foundation of our diversity and pluralism. And foundations really that I think would survive through this latest incarnation of the war, through this all-out war of Russia on Ukraine.
We started talking about war. How do you see the democratic world and specifically democracy survive in the region with this big attempt to basically kill the democracy, kill Ukrainian nation, and attempt to basically wage the war against the West?
Well, Ukrainians who are now fighting and dying on the fields of eastern and southern Ukraine and in the streets of Donbass, they believe that they're fighting actually not for themselves and not only for their own country. They believe that they're fighting for European values, and that they're fighting for Europe. They expect to be understood, to take those claims at face value. And also they expect support and help on many levels. But what that means is that basically they indeed are defending more than themselves. And if the military operation that was conceived by Putin and the general staff of the Russian army in the months leading to this war would end with success, if there would be just a couple of weeks, 3 days, and Kyiv would fall, and really the entire Ukraine, that was the goal, would be within the hold of Russia. What that would mean, that would be not just victory for Russia, that would be victory also for the authoritarian forms of government and authoritarian forms of government, not just in the region, but everywhere in the world, from China going to the United States of America, where, of course, this authoritarian model was considered to be very attractive only a few short years ago. The fact that Ukraine withstood that attack, that it fights and defeats very often the most feared army in the world, the army that represents authoritarian regime that is built in a very authoritarian manner and partially because of that loses, this is already a victory for the democratic governments and democratic regimes. And we talk about that very often in geographic terms and country by country. That's what we were doing before. But this authoritarian tendencies, they're strong in almost every democratic country as well. So this victory in Ukraine today is victory not just for a particular region, not for a particular bloc, not for a political country. It's victory for the democratic forces all over the world.
Thank you to Serhii Plochy for this historical and broader context. And I would like now to turn to Miroslava Gongadze, who conducted the interview and who is the Eastern European chief for Voice of America.
Good afternoon, or it's morning still. It's a pleasure to be here today and see all of you here, so many young people. It's not that often that you can see full room of eager to learn people. It's a pleasure to be here today. I presented to you Serhii Plochy, my dear friend from Harvard, and he's one of the best historian and writer on Ukraine and Eastern Europe history. And if you Google him today, please pick up his books, because if you want to learn about the region, if you want to learn about Russia, if you want to learn about Ukraine, this is the best source, beautifully written books about the region. And honestly, I don't have much to say because I think he said it all. However, only one thing probably I would add, that I'm Ukrainian. I don't know, is anyone here in this room has Ukrainian roots? We talked, oh, fantastic. We talked about Ukraine a lot in this conference. Basically, this is the like red line, red thread through the discussions of this conference. However, I feel a little bit that we are talking about Ukraine without Ukraine, as they said. So I'm happy to be here today and actually give you maybe some in-depth what is really going on out there. I just came back from Kyiv last week. And I have to tell you, you are a very, very happy and lucky people here in this room to enjoy quiet, peace, and freedom. To enjoy the fact that you can make your mind, you can speak your mind, you can make your own decisions. Today in Ukraine, people don't have that freedom. They are constantly shelled by the rockets. I've been to Chernihiv region near Belarusian borders. I've been to Kyiv region. We talked about Bucha. We talked about other places, Irpin. I've been to other places. Totally destroyed. Young kids, 2-year-old kids, running on the burned houses, saying, I am not afraid, I am not afraid. And I'm like, what is this child is saying? The mother, during the shelling, was telling the child, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. And the child is running around and just repeating that word. Ukraine is suffering, but at the same time, Ukraine is very resilient. And I talk to those people, and they already start rebuilding their lives. They said, we are not looking back, we would be looking forward, we would survive. They are fighting for their own existence, yes, but they are fighting for all of us, for our freedom. Because if Ukraine will fail, it would be the first chip. Russia would go further. And in last 20 years of this Western policies toward Russia, this is the point we have to make a decision to actually stand up for what is right and what is moral. And there's people yesterday, students here, were asking questions like, why should we help Ukraine? Or Ukraine is not democracy, what is the point of helping? Ukraine is fighting for democracy for the last 30 years, and I paid my personal price for that fight. A lot of people paid their personal price for that fight. Something is black and white in the world. There were the victim and there were aggressor. We have to support the victim. If you see somebody is beaten up on the street, your duty is to help that person to be safe. We have to help Ukraine, not for Ukraine. You help Ukraine for yourself. You actually have to ask Ukraine today, help us to save our democratic world. And the point is, we have to do everything possible in our means to give Ukraine what it's asked, because they are ready to fight for the West. I will stop here and we'll give the floor to
Thank you, Miroslava, for those important words. This needed to be said, and I'm thanking you for saying it. So with that, Dora Györfi of the Corvinus University in Budapest, please go ahead.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to be here again at the Astori Political Forum. It's a 30-year forum. I've been here. This is my 7th year at the conference, and thank you for Professor Espada for always inviting me. For me, it's always a breath of fresh air being in this room and after events in Budapest. Throughout these years, we have discussed the threats of authoritarianism to the rules-based international order and the transatlantic alliance, but somehow the dangers were always diffused, and somehow there were always some internal failures of Western democracy we could point to why populism is happening and all that is happening. Rather than focusing on the hybrid warfare Russia had been already waging against the West for a long time, for over the decade, but it was undercover. But after February 24, the war is out in the open. And I very much agree with Miroslava that we should have absolutely no illusions. The unjustifiable attack on the freedom and sovereignty of Ukraine is an attack on the West and everything it represents. Russia makes absolutely no secret that it aims to go forward after Ukraine, and specific countries have received threats. This includes Poland, Lithuania, and Britain. In public television, and Putin and his people personally were threatening them. Currently, the Suwalki corridor is the most dangerous area around Russia. Nicolas Tenser, a French author, put the main issue here, the deeper attack on the West. And I quote, "What Putin wants to destroy is the very idea of humanity and what goes with it: freedom, beauty, nobility of feeling, generosity, altruism, joy, everything that represents something like a form of greatness. He intends to show that the supposed forces of reason, morality, and justice will never be strong enough to resist the steamroller of devastating liberation from any rule. This nihilist project must be defeated, Ukraine must win, and the West must continue to help in military, political, economic, and humanitarian spheres." So this is moral clarity. This is a black and white issue, as Miroslava said, but Putin still counts on Western failures to live up to its own ideals. And this is the same belief that we heard in the previous panel from Xi Jinping, also believes in the decline of the West. Putin's cynical belief in the decline of the West is not simply a delusion, but is also informed by personal experience with Western actors in the past decade. His widespread success in corrupting Western officials and businessmen could give him the impression that everybody is for sale, and references to values are just empty slogans without real commitment. He had agents working for him in politics and the business world, in the US, the UK, and the European Union. There are many books discussing this network of ecosystem in Western business and legal profession. I particularly advise you to read the recently published book by Bill Browder, Freezing Order. He's Putin's arch enemy and promoter of the...
It's on my bedside table.
Okay, on mine too. Promoter of the Magnitsky human rights legislation worldwide. Russia also has influence over Western governments, and Putin signals confidence in his ability to sow division in the transatlantic alliance. I am speaking here today as a Hungarian, and I'm also the only one at the conference, and I cannot avoid expressing the shame I feel over the policies of the Hungarian government in hindering assistance to Ukraine and undermining Western unity. So what can I add to the discussion? I think as a Hungarian, I qualify to speak about the logic and dangers of appeasement. And I have 4 points. It's only natural that people want peace, especially Ukrainians, but appeasers hide behind emphasizing their desire for peace over the crimes of Russian aggression. In Hungary, the simple message of "we want peace" led to another constitutional majority for Orban in the April elections, while the united opposition, which aimed to provide support for Ukraine, was painted as a warmonger who threatens the security of Hungary. Obscuring and relativizing the responsibility for the war, desensitizing the public to the ongoing genocide in Ukraine, advocating for compromise and concessions is a distinct Russian strategic narrative which shifts responsibility for its criminal enterprise to those who resist its power. And when we talk about appeasement, I also want to cite from Churchill, and Karl Gershman yesterday cited from the same speech that I have here from 1940. So each one hopes that if he feeds the crocodile enough, the crocodile will eat him last. All of them hope that the storm will pass before their turn comes to be devoured. But I fear greatly that the storm will not pass. It will rage and it will roar ever more loudly, ever more wildly. And this is the case we have with Russia now. We don't have to go back to 1938 and Munich. There is truth in the analogy, only if you look at that after 2014, a neutral Ukraine made concessions about the Crimea and the Donbass regions, only to find that a few years later, Russia wants to eradicate Ukraine and Ukrainians from the map. Beyond the desire for peace, rising energy prices, inflation, and an approaching recession are also likely to lead to sanctions fatigue in the West, or at least Putin strongly expects so. He aims to exacerbate the situation by blocking the Black Sea ports to prevent Ukrainian grain export. This could cause famine in the Middle East and North Africa, thus threatening Europe with another migration wave. Putin's condition for unblocking the ports is sanction relief. Through his blackmailing, he's again shifting responsibility for his own crimes to those who resist his aggression. The explicit condition of sanctions relief, however, indicates that an otherwise Russian strategic narrative about the ineffectiveness of sanctions is false. Sanctions are painful for the Russian economy and cause much more severe disruption than the Russians like to admit it. In the West, it should be recognized that there is no way back to the pre-war era and economic relations with Russia. If the West does not include certain elements in the sanctions package because it's too painful, it will be Russia which weaponizes this relationship and uses the measure as a punishment for other sanctions. The instability of gas supplies to Europe is a case to this point. The third point I want to make about appeasement. While longing for peace and economic stability are valid sentiments in the face of war, there are more sinister factors behind the calls for appeasement. For over a decade, Putin has successfully employed various methods of hybrid warfare against the West: strategic corruption, various channels of propaganda, and the financing of extremist parties in Europe, left and right. While sanctions are making it increasingly difficult to continue these activities, we should have no doubts that a decade of mischief cannot be undone in a couple of months. Russian dark money in the West is hidden behind layers of anonymous shell companies. Thus, measures such as confiscated yachts are only scratching the surface. It is important to seriously investigate all these funds to uncover and seize them. Political actors who have been corrupted by Russia in the past decades can still worry about compromise in the case they do not resist Russian objectives. While official propaganda channels like the RT and Sputnik was shut down, there are plenty of other possibilities for Russia-friendly actors to spread the message of appeasement and confusion. In Hungary, around 80% of the media are basically controlled by the government, and they keep presenting Russian narratives and prospect of certain Russian victories. The most popular Facebook pages are openly rooting for Russia. These pressures towards appeasement are exacerbated by institutional weaknesses, and this is particularly serious in the European Union, where every country has a veto power, so a single leader can act as a Trojan horse for Putin and soften or delay sanctions. And I have to finish, so 2 more points. The problem beyond this lies over conflict over basic values and the ability of the European Union to reinforce its founding principles as elaborated in Article 2, and compromising on these values within the European Union and appeasing authoritarianism within the European Union eventually dismantles the European project. Appeasement does not work with autocrats inside or outside the EU. A sense of weakness only emboldens them. And this is the case with Putin and Orban as well. And the last thing really I want to say, just one sentence, is that with all these vulnerabilities, the West has greatly surprised Russia with its unity and support for Ukraine. Putin does not believe that this support can last, but the West should really show that it's stronger than Putin believes it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dora, for this important point. And following up on your remarks, one important element of the Western support for Ukraine and the unity of West in this regard will be the way how Ukrainian partnership with EU and eventual membership of the EU will develop. And on that note, I would like to ask Ken Godfrey to say us a few words.
Thank you very much, Jakub. So I think I'll start by disappointing everyone by saying I don't have a Churchill quote, but he is the best quote. So if we extend the issue of a crocodile, Putin, of course, we can all very easily criticize, but it's also nice to see that on the 21st of February, Vladimir Putin essentially said that Ukraine is not a country. It sort of denied the statehood of Ukraine. And last week, on the 23rd of June, the European Union, which I specialize in, I'm based in Brussels, agreed to the accession, granting candidate status, so starting accession procedure of Ukraine. A massive change. This is a huge, huge change, and we shouldn't deny it. At this same meeting, so all EU leaders met. They have these council conclusions that come out of the meetings where EU leaders meet. The EU also decided to start the process of granting 9 billion euros of macroeconomic assistance. This is basically because of the balance of payments problems of the Ukrainian government. It's also delivered, as we heard yesterday, 1.5 billion in military aid, which is a revolution at European level. It's also committing another 500 million. The EU has also sent over 750 million of humanitarian aid to Ukraine. It all sounds great, right? It's a lot of money. All of this is a lot of money. But we also heard yesterday the United States government has put in 40 billion US dollars. That's in varying, if you look at the figures, as with the EU, maybe some of it is rather high and corresponds to some funds that have already been committed. But the figures are good. The figures are good in terms of news, and the figures are important in terms of the commitment of European Union, as well as the United States and other allies. But what does this mean for Ukraine? So what does this all mean for Ukraine? And what does it mean for the European Union? So for Ukraine, I think there's two things. The first is it's a massive moral boost, the fact that there is this accession process. We shouldn't underestimate, as we heard from Miroslava, that there is massive suffering. The scars will stay for a long time. I have many friends in Ukraine, colleagues as well, and they're going through an incredibly difficult moment. Many have left or moved to the west of the country. And they've done much of this also for a brighter future, which includes EU membership. So it's a very important message to be giving. There's a second part of what it means for Ukraine. I think that's a massive economic boost. Now, we can say, of course, that the war is an even bigger economic downturn for Ukraine. But accession brings a lot of financial benefits, or it would, to the Ukrainian economy. Firstly, there's a whole platform that's being created. So if nobody knows about this, then it's important that you know, between the Ukrainian government and the European Union institutions. It's for the reconstruction of Ukraine. There will be international financial institutions involved, European Union member states, oversight from the European Parliament, oversight from the Rada in Ukraine. And at the same time, we also have to be aware that these whole negotiations for membership will take a long time and they'll be very difficult. The GDP per capita of Ukraine is under $5,000 a year. The poorest EU member state, Bulgaria, is at 13,000. The second poorest is Romania, 15,000. That's triple Ukraine. So the amount of funding from Europe will be massive, and the amount of dedication of European Union and European Union citizens to Ukraine needs to be incredibly strong for this to work. Even look at the Common Agricultural Policy. The Common Agricultural Policy is a massive chunk of the European Union budget. Well, the biggest amount of farmland in the whole of the European continent is in Ukraine. So you can see the challenges straight off the bat. So let me continue on that, what does this mean for the European Union? I think there are four things that are important, European Union, things that have changed in Europe as a result of the war and the invasion. The first is security. We heard enough about that yesterday, so I won't go into it in too much detail. Second, what I've mentioned before, is the accession process. It's important for Ukraine, but I'd also say it's important for Europe. It's very much a self-reflection of what does the European Union want to be? What do European Union member states want the EU to be? And what do European citizens want European cooperation to look like? So somehow I felt even that these discussions were also less about Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, and even more about what European leaders saw as the role of the European Union. And you can already see quite a bit of pushback from countries in the Western Balkans as a result of the agreement to grant candidate status to Moldova and Ukraine. The third major issue is the economy. There are big challenges ahead. You can see in bond spreads already. You can also see very clearly in energy prices. At the same time, you can see cost of living, food prices. This will all impact the European Union and the whole neighborhood of the European Union. I'd like to finish on the fourth point, which is the unity of the European Union. So there are the six sanctions package was agreed to recently. It took a long time unfortunately because of the Hungarian government, but there were others who hid behind the Hungarian government who were very worried about increases in gas prices or a reduction of flow in gas to Europe. This has a potential to dramatically change both the relationship between European Union member states. Imagine Germany, for example, which has had quite solid supplies of gas from Russia for a number of years, asking the Netherlands for gas for its chemicals industry or for its car industry. It will change very significantly the relationship between those countries. So there's a lot that will be tested. And the thing that the unity is very commendable at this stage. At the same time, if you look at surveys of European citizens, so the European Council on Foreign Relations released a survey last week. There are some troubling signs on the horizon. And I think that I'll end by just saying that we need to be prepared, even everyone in this room, that there will be economic consequences for all of our pockets as a result of this invasion. And we need to stay the course in order for the response to be successful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken, for highlighting some of these important challenges that are ahead of us. And last but not least, I would like to ask Zdzislaw Mach from Krakow, from the Krakow University, to maybe look a little bit on Russia itself.
Okay, thank you very much. Is it okay? Can you hear me? Yes, oh, good. Well, first of all, I'm extremely happy to be here again and to speak on this panel, although, of course, we all would prefer to be in different circumstances, not in the context of war. And when I'm looking at this title of this conference, Confronting the Authoritarian Challenge, I thought, what kind of imagination would had to be in order, because at the time that this title was invented, obviously, we didn't know anything about what kind of challenge we would have to be confronted with. My modest contribution to this panel discussion is going to be focused on society, the social aspects of mainly Russian, on the Russian side, but also there are some implications which I would like also to mention on European and Ukrainian part, because quite rightly, when the war is still going on, and we don't really, it's hard to say what would happen in the coming weeks and months, but quite rightly, we already think about the reconstruction of Ukraine, rebuilding of Ukraine, and this reconstruction of Ukraine would have to be not only about infrastructure and the economy, but also, especially in the view of the European decision to grant Ukraine from the status of a candidate for membership, it would also have to be about society, because we obviously know that probably the negotiations would take a while, maybe a long while. We wish it would be successful and quickly successful, but there will have to be the Copenhagen criteria and criteria of membership in the European Union also include not only economic and political, but also social issues. And also when we think of Europe, the integration of the European Union, yesterday there was a very interesting discussion about it, that one of the outcomes of one of the effects of the war in Ukraine is that it's becoming more obvious than ever that the European Union must be integrated, must be united, must be able to speak one voice also on the international, on foreign policy and defense policy. But we are having problems in the European Union. There is a growing populism in many countries, and as we just heard, and we all know, of course, that in some countries, especially like Poland and Hungary, liberal values are not perhaps the highest priority of the current regimes, and these regimes are supported by a very big chunk of the population, maybe by the majority. So the question which I was originally intended to ask, and I still want to ask now quickly, is why Russians seem to support Putin. I say seem to support because we don't have reliable sociological studies that would give us a clear answer, but what surveys, what we can get from surveys is that really Putin is supported by the majority of his society. So what did he do? What did he give Russians? We know, and some of us may remember, that what was the conditions of the Russian society before Putin. There was a lot of humiliation, there was loss of dignity, there was chaos, or which we can follow, I may use the concept which Anthony Giddens made so popular, the loss of ontological security, the feeling that we no longer live in this in the world which has meaning, which we understand, which we comprehend and know how to operate in. There was loss of dignity, loss of ontological security, and also other aspects of security in the Russian society. And also there was this feeling among the Russians, quite understandably, that they've been degraded from the status of the superpower that everybody respected and also many people feared, to the status of a second category of player that seemed to be playing no much role in on an international scale. And then Putin came and promised to restore this dignity and to restore law and order and to give the feeling of strength and dignity back to Russians. It's hard to say to what extent he actually did it, but he made this promise. Also, Russians believe, and they believed in the past also, to some extent, of course, rightly, that they liberated Europe, especially Eastern Europe, from the Nazis, the Nazi occupation, and also that during the Soviet times they supported the economies of satellite countries. And now there is a feeling in Russian society that Ukrainians, but also Poles and the Baltic countries and all the former communist countries are being ungrateful, that they turn their backs to Russia and opt for integration with the West. And this is what Russians, they feel quite bitter about it. So, well, of course, Ukraine is one of those countries. So when Putin says Ukraine is just a smaller brother who culturally belongs to Russia and should follow Russia and the Russians, I think this resonates quite well among many people in the Russian society. So of course they support Putin, who at least has attempted to restore the Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire, but also to give the Russians the feeling of respect and strength, and the feeling of being feared. It's also, for the students of populism, it's also known that this loss of ontological security results in a tendency, on the one hand, to go back to what is understood as traditional values, a need to get simple answers to difficult questions, but also strong leadership. A strong leader who would guide us to the future and who would solve problems for us. This is a very tempting choice. So I suppose we must be aware of this, that this is something which exists in Russia, but also exists in some other parts. I mean, I live in Poland, so I can detect many symptoms of this populist tendencies in the Polish society as well. And we know what are the political implications of it. So, what are the implications of this? Well, first of all, Putin may survive or may be replaced by some others, but Russia would remain dangerous until there are fundamental changes in the Russian society. And we in this room and this conference, I'm sure we understand particularly well, because we stand by and we promote and we speak a lot about the liberal values, about individualism, about liberal democracy, and about liberal civil society. For Europe and for Ukraine, the lesson is that the reconstruction of Ukraine should also go together with the building of a liberal civil society and liberal democracy in Ukraine, and for the European Union, that we should stand by these liberal values, even if it would mean that pressure will have to be exerted on those countries in the European Union which are steering away from liberal values and tend to understand democracy as simply the rule of the majority. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mach, and thank you to all the speakers for being very disciplined with their time. But still, this was a packed session, so we have virtually almost no time for questions. But still, you know, at least symbolically, I would like to take two, if I may. And yes, so I'll take one from here, the lady in front. And please, if you can make it in 30 seconds.
I'll be very quickly. My name is Livia Franco. I'm a professor and researcher here at the Institute. Ken Godfrey mentioned that the European Union Council decided to grant candidate status to Moldova and Ukraine. What about Georgia? Because, as you mentioned, this is also not only about those countries, but about Europe and what we want Europe to be. Thank you.
Thank you. And there was a... yes, please.
My question is to Professor Jadislav. Do you believe there's some sense of revisionism and eagerness amongst the Poles for Russia to conclude some sort of mistakenly aggression on Poland in order to fulfill this nationalist revisionism sentiment towards the Russian?
Okay, and I will take one more question. Karl Gershman, over there.
Just very quickly to Miroslava, as the Ukrainian here, will you please define what it means to win?
Oh.
From the Ukrainian point of view.
Should I start quickly?
Yes, and we will start actually in the reverse order. So Miroslava, please.
Actually, it's a very good question because that's the question I'm asking everyone. Every politician, every leaders that I interviewed in the last week. I think for Ukraine to win is to clear their territory. They don't want to wage the war against Russia. They want to defend themselves and defend democracy and their rights to exist and the rights to determine their own future. So for Ukraine to win is to unite their territories and to every last Russian soldier leave Ukraine, including Crimea. That's my assessment of what others are telling me and what my assessment is. However, we understand that until Putin is there or until totalitarian power is in Russia, we would never be safe. Ukraine would have to learn how to survive because that neighbor would be always there. And that's the, again, question to the last speaker about how to change Russia. To the point of East for European Union, one more point. It would be fifth, probably, right? I think for Ukraine is very, very crucial, not just only symbolic to get membership, to get candidate status. For Ukraine, it's a roadmap for future success. Because the society is very, Ukrainian society is very troubled, as I said. It would be trauma. It would be a lot of, people would be longing for a strong hand. We know this already. So that rules that would be set by European Union, I think is the only thing that can save Ukraine for the future to build a stronger democracy. So,
thank you. So basically, let's take the opportunity to answer the questions and also say your concluding remarks within, let's say, 1 minute. So we continue with Dora, please.
I didn't get question.
Okay. So, but no concluding remarks.
I have one sentence from the paper which I didn't read, so I want to join Miroslava and what would be victory for the West. I think it's important to define, and I agree with Karl Gershman yesterday. So I think an optimal end to this war is a much weaker Russia, a more careful China vis-à-vis Taiwan, a reinvigorated transatlantic alliance, a unified West, and the strengthening of liberal values across the world. And I think this is possible, and I think it's important to be aware that it's going to be a long road and a long war. And the West should remain united. Thank you.
Thank you. Ken?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So what happened at the European Council is that they granted the perspective of membership to Georgia, but not the candidate. So my interpretation of that is that there were a couple of considerations. One is the current domestic political situation in Georgia. The second one, I think, is unsaid but very important, which is the geographic consideration. So Moldova is between Ukraine and Romania. So it's a very logical. The government is also on a very pro-EU path at the moment, so that helps. But to me, those are the main reasons: domestic political considerations, and I think geographic ones that are not really said officially. Yeah.
Zdzislaw, please.
Well, I don't think there was any question directly to me, but I think that if there was this question of revenge and nationalism, and well, I suppose it's only human that some feelings of revenge might be generated, especially by those the atrocities which were hopefully this will not take this direction, because revenge never leads to anything positive. Nationalism is, of course, a very dangerous sentiment, as we know very well, and we should really make whatever effort possible to promote liberal values rather than collective sentiments and ideologies like nationalism is, and again that the situation of war makes it very easy to think and act in the frame of nationalism. So especially in the countries which have this kind of collective memory. Poland has it, Ukraine has it, Hungary has it. So these are the processes which, promoters of liberal democracy really must take as a priority. Whether what to do in order to change the Russian society, well, that's a very, very difficult challenge and a long process. I don't know. We cannot do much, except that we should support liberal institutions in Russia if they still exist, and to the extent they can be supported, like NGOs. But of course that's a very difficult thing to do.
Thank you, and I would like Luis to ask you for your concluding words.
Thank you very much. In 3 sentences, to reflect that the war in Ukraine, what is happening in Ukraine, is not far. There is no distance, and we need to have an acute awareness of that. We are not reflecting upon something that is happening far away. It is now, it is with us, it is really very near to us. Then the second sentence would be on what are you prepared to do, what are we prepared to sacrifice individually and collectively to uphold our values, our freedom, our liberty, our democracies. And then my last comment would be on the importance of keeping tight the transatlantic relationship. If I would be an adversary or an enemy of the West, my main concern, my main strategic objective would be to divide the 2 shores of the North Atlantic Ocean. The transatlantic link is irreplaceable, and it is not the European Union of Defence, the deepening of the European Union of Defence, that really represents replacement for the transatlantic relationship. And the simple fact that Finland and Sweden would like now to join the North Atlantic Alliance is a very clear answer to that question. If the European Union of Defence, in its reformulated, more deepened dimension, would be enough, why Sweden and Finland would need to join the North Atlantic Alliance. So with that, I would leave you really with one of my favorite subject matters: keep the transatlantic relationship alive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.